You've probably heard this saying. You know that one, right? It's a well-known expression in English. I said that in the Italian. They didn't have a kind of equivalent. Didn't go over too well. But anyway. It means it's not good to meet people that you hold in high esteem because most likely they're going to disappoint you. You see, in our heads, we have this elevated image of who they are, and then you meet them, and you find out they're different. Now, I've heard a number of stories, and they usually go like this. Ordinary person meets famous person in real life. Movie star, actress, sports star, celebrity pastor. Someone they've always looked up to. And when they meet them, they find out that the person is arrogant or rude or just a terrible example of a human being. Now, that specific phrase, never meet your heroes, it's a modern one. It goes back to around the 70s or 80s is when we first find it. But it's definitely an older sentiment than that. There's a novel published in the 1850s, Madame Bovary, and there's a line which goes like this in French, so I'll give you the English version. You should never touch your idols. A little of the gold always rubs off. I like that one. So the fact is, being disappointed with heroes has been around a little bit longer than the last 50 years. I wonder how long have people been disappointed with other people? A long time. Has anyone had this experience themselves? Some nods. Anyone want to kind of give an example? We'll hand the mic around. You can just tell us who. Famous person even? Something easier? Famous person? Who was a famous person? Okay. Let's stop right there. Disappointing, right? Yeah, disappointing. I don't have any good stories. I will go back to that one later, off the mic. I met Jackie Chan once in real life. Yeah. Saw him on a movie set. He signed a little poster. I had my picture taken with him. It said, "Dear Andrew, best wishes, Jackie Chan." That was it. No disappointment. That was it. I want to talk about our relationships with heroes in the Bible. There's a very famous passage in a letter we have in the New Testament called Hebrews, and it's in chapter 11. There's this wonderful discussion about faith, and you'd know this one for sure. It begins like this. Now, faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. For lots of Christians, this is the go-to verse for, what does faith mean? Many quote it by heart. In verse 2, the writer, it continues and says, this example is what the ancients were commended for, this example of a type of faith. And verse 4, then he says, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he's dead. And so what you find in the remainder of this chapter 11 are examples of people in the Old Testament who lived by faith. Lots of people you might remember, Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and many, many others. In some Bibles, this section, how there's section headings in the Bible? In some Bibles, they call this heroes of faith. So we often use this phrase, heroes of faith, when we talk about these notable people in the Bible. I think especially with Old Testament characters. But I've also heard Paul described as a hero of the faith. And if you're going to pick Paul, you'd say the rest of the disciples too. Maybe except Judas. Just definitely not Judas. So today I'm going to pick an example that was mentioned in Hebrews of a hero of the faith. Most of you might know the story of Gideon. My home group definitely knows the story of Gideon. Now, why it's memorable is because we've probably heard messages about it, maybe in Sunday school. And there's just so many elements that sort of stick in your brain. It's got great kind of pieces in it. And I'm going to look at them first, just to quickly review it. But I want to also look at the parts of that story that aren't so memorable, that you may not remember, but they're important. So let me start with a quick background here. So Gideon, he lives in a time when there's no kings. This is the pre-king period in Israel. And so the nation was a collection of tribes. You know, they've got the land, but they don't have a central government. And they're, as usual, their existence is threatened by foreign nations. So the leaders at that time were called judges. And in today's language, we think of judges as people who decide cases of law, which they did, but it does mean more than that in that particular context. The judges were often like clan chieftains or military leaders. So they would lead in sometimes in war and in peace as well. Now, unlike the period where Moses and Joshua led, during the period of Judges, the tribes weren't that aligned. They weren't exactly unified. And we see this cycle, which we saw later even in Kings, times when Israel turns away from God, and then times when Israel turns towards God. It's just this repeating thing. So Gideon's story begins, of course, when Israel has turned away from God. The country has been invaded by these nomadic, the Midianites and other peoples, and they're described as numerous as locusts. They destroy the crops, they've left the land impoverished. And so the people cried out, and God sends an angel to this unimportant person called Gideon. He's hiding in a winepress, and he's threshing wheat. It's not the place where you thresh wheat, but you got to make do in those times. Because he's afraid of being seen, right? And the angel says to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, I'm sure he didn't feel either of those things at that moment. And Gideon says, he was very polite. You'll see this. His parents must have raised him well. "Pardon me, my Lord. If God's with us, where has he been all this time? If God's with us, why am I hiding from the Midianites?" Which I guess is a fair question. I'm not sure if it's a fair question when an angel is speaking to you, but he was honest. And the angel says this to him, "Go in the strength you have, because I'm sending you." Go in the strength that you have. Wasn't much. "But I will supply everything else you need." And Gideon says, "Pardon me, my Lord. How can I do this? My clan is the weakest, and I'm the least in my family." And the angel responds, "I will be with you." It doesn't say pardon me, but Gideon says, "Can you show me a sign?" Because the angel wasn't enough of a sign. So he brings the angel a sacrifice of a young goat and bread, and the angel touches the rock with a staff, and it burns up miraculously. Then the angel disappears. And finally, Gideon says, "I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face." So Gideon, now he's full of the Spirit of God. He blows the horn. And when he blows the horn, it means he calls together the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Now, there were, 12 tribes, so he's only got some of them. But nonetheless, 32,000 men turn up. And you'd think that would be a fairly decent confidence boost for Gideon. But he turns to God and he says, "God, I'm feeling a bit nervous about the plan. If you're really going to be with us, I need just another sign to be absolutely certain. So what I'll do is I'll put this fleece out tonight, and in the morning, if the fleece is wet and the ground's dry, I'll definitely know, this is your plan. I know it's you." And of course, it was. That's what happened. Gideon says, don't be mad, God. Just, if you're really, really going to be with us, I just need another sign. I'll put out the fleece tonight, but let's, in the morning, if it's dry and the ground's wet, then I'll for sure, 100% know it's you. And it was. So it only took 3 signs for Gideon to know that God was speaking to him. Now, God says to Gideon, you've got too many men. I don't want the Israelites to think that this victory is because of their strength. So, tell them this. If anyone at all is scared, they can just go home. And so 22,000 men went home. It took hours for the dust to settle. It's a lot of scared men. I was like, phew, I'm so glad he said that. And then God says, Gideon, look, you still got too many men. We need to thin them out just a bit more. So tell them to go get a drink of water. And so the army, they go down to the river and they get a drink of water. And 300 men, they scoop up the water like this and they drink out of their hands. And the rest of them, they stick their head in the water. And then God says, tell the ones who put their head in the water to go home. So 9,700 men go home. And if you were a water scooper, I bet you wished you stuck your head in the... So Gideon starts with, he assembles an army of 32,000, and God says you only need 300. Only 300 are required. Gideon directs each soldier to take a trumpet and to take a torch and to put the torch in the jar. And it's a lit torch. And they, at midnight, they assembled and they encircled the camp of the Midianites. It was an immense kind of encampment. And at the signal, they all blew their trumpets and they smashed the jars and they exposed these 300 torches right in the middle of the night. And then Gideon's men, they just stood at the boundary. They didn't do anything else. Because the battle, it was the Lord's. And the Midianites, in complete panic, thinking they were surrounded and they were under attack by a large force of the enemy, they attacked each other, and then they fled the camp. It was a complete rout. And it was only then that Gideon then called out the tribes to pursue the Midianites. And the enemy was routed, and Midianite leaders were killed. So, God had a great victory that day and delivered Israel from the hands of their enemies. Gideon's story has all these wonderful and memorable moments. There's more to it, but those are the highlights. There's the angel, there's the fleece again, there's the men drinking at the water, and there's 300 men with trumpets and torches. So it's no wonder that this story of Gideon and he himself is remembered as a hero. And that's usually where the story ends. In story terms, we love a good ending on a good climax, right? But today, we're going to see the story through to the end. Are you ready for the rest? Does anyone remember the rest? Yeah. Okay. Remember what I said. Never meet your heroes. So in chapter 8, Gideon and the army crossed the Jordan, and they continued to pursue the remains of the Midianite army. They're routed, but there's still some that are left. And so on the other side of the river, they pass a town called Sukkot. And Gideon says to the town, can you give us food for the hungry troops? Right, they're exhausted. And he explains they're pursuing these Midianite leaders, these Midianite kings. Now, the town refuses to help him. These are also Israelites. They're from the tribe of Manasseh. It's the same tribe he's in. But they don't believe Gideon will succeed in his mission, and they probably fear the wrath of the Midianites if he fails, right? They helped him. And if you think about it, to be fair, Gideon didn't have much success in his faith, in this mission either. I mean, it took 3 signs from God for him to finally believe. But he responds, I guess, in anger. He promises the town, after he catches those fleeing kings, he'll come back and he'll beat the leaders with thorns and briars. All right. Next, Gideon goes to another town called Peniel, and he asks for food. And the same thing happens. And so he tells them something different. When I triumph, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tear down your tower. This time he won't beat the leaders. He'll destroy the town's defenses. In case you're not clear, these people aren't the enemy. These are Israelites from his own tribe. Sure, they're not kind of supporting him, but they're his own people. So Gideon and his army, they pursue the fleeing Midianites. They go further east, and when they finally catch him, once again, there's a rout, and he captures these two kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. And on the way home, on return, he's won, right? Victory is assured here. He makes a stop. He stops by the town of Sukkot. He stops by the town of Peniel. True to his word, he finds the 72 elders of the town of Sukkot, and he has them beaten with thorns. He stops by Peniel. He has its defensive tower torn down. And the men in Peniel, they're killed. He's supposed to be a judge of Israel. What's going on with Gideon? So Gideon, he interrogates these two captured kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. And when they confess that they were responsible for killing his brothers, Gideon says this to them: as sure as Yahweh lives, as sure as God lives, I would have spared your lives. But now I found this out, you must die. So he kills them with his own sword. What's Gideon's motive here? This isn't God's command. This is personal revenge. If they didn't do it, he wasn't going to kill him. But he's going to get even. What's going on with Gideon? Nonetheless, the Midianites, they're subdued. And Israel, as a result, has peace for over 40 years. But there's this disturbing final note in the story. A bit of a plot twist. So the Israelites, they offer Gideon the kingship of Israel. And that's not the plot twist. He refuses. But in verse 24, he says this: I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. And what's going on here? That's what kings do, right? Kings ask for a share of the plunder. And a little later on in verse 27, it says, Gideon made the gold that they gave him into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his hometown. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Not a lot to read between the lines there, is there? The story, it turns so quickly. There's, a few questionable decisions, but it all falls off a cliff. So Gideon, he takes the spoils of victory and he turns it into a holy relic. And I guess it seemed like a good idea at the time, which he then keeps in his hometown. I guess like he was significantly responsible for the victory here. Why not? Right? And what was this ephod really? Well, normally we understand it to be like a garment, a holy garment that would be worn. But in this case here, it could be describing something else because the people worshipped it. Whatever it was something that God didn't ask him to do, at least as far as the text shows us. And if it was inspired by simply good intentions, it leads the people into idolatry. They worshiped the ephod and not God who had saved them. And the ephod, it entangles both Gideon and his family, and in a way it destroys his family's legacy. You'll see at the end of the chapter. As a result, Gideon was, like no other judge, the only judge recorded as leading Israel into idolatry. It's a really disappointing final scene. What do we do with these heroes who let us down? Never meet your heroes. Now, the Bible never calls Gideon a hero of faith. I told you that some Bibles use that as a heading for Hebrews 11, but that's not found in the original text. That's just what someone has thought about. You won't find that phrase anywhere in the New Testament. Do you know who calls Gideon a hero? We do. It's our fault. We should stop doing it. I don't think we should see any of the characters in the Old or New Testament as our heroes, save one, and only one. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 and 12 is making this argument about Jesus, that he is the fulfillment of all of God's promises in the Old Testament. That the faith of these people, like these examples that he's talking about, like Gideon, but the faith they showed in God was a promise for which none of them received in their lifetime. You know, specifically in 37, it says, these were all commended, the people, for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. In verse 12, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, he scorned its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. That's an amazing passage. Jesus was always the hero we were all waiting for. Jesus was always the hero that Israel was waiting for. So going back to Judges, the story of Gideon isn't his story at all. Oh, sure, Gideon's in it. He's an important character in that particular plot. But we are reading that story completely wrong if we think Gideon is the hero. Gideon was waiting on a promise from God. The story in the book of Judges is the story of God. In our Bible, God is the hero. He's a hero who wants to save and restore Israel, the people that he loves. God's also the hero in Exodus. He's the hero in Kings. And all the other books we call sacred. The revelation of Jesus Christ is that he fulfills all of God's promises to not only the people of Israel, but also to humanity, to us today. Jesus Christ becomes our true hero. He becomes our true king. They were looking for a king, right? He's a true king. The King of Kings. Now, this isn't a campaign by me personally to stamp out the phrase heroes of faith. I've used the phrase myself. I'm sure it's used a fair amount like in Sunday school lessons. It's not a big drama. Getting everyone to stop using it isn't going to accomplish anything in and of itself. I think it's natural for people to look for heroes. I think it's the way we see the world, but I think that can also be a problem. It's why we enjoy the good parts of Gideon, and we don't enjoy the bad parts. They're difficult to come to grips with. We think of ourselves as heroes in our own stories. Think about that. We think of ourselves as heroes in our own stories. It's like our default viewpoint, and it's how we make sense of the events in our lives. It's how we apply meaning in our life. We are the leading actresses, we're the leading actors in our own story. But maybe that's not the right way to read our lives. It's not the right way to read the Bible. What if, come with me here, what if we aren't the heroes? What if true life in Christ, a life lived in the Spirit, made God the main character in our lives? Not ourselves, but God. Not ourselves, but Jesus Christ. Not ourselves, but His Holy Spirit. What if? Now, I don't mean we're erased from our story. We all have a part to play. All those characters in the Bible did as well. But we're not the main character. He is the main character. The plot doesn't actually revolve around us. It revolves around Him. Think about the angst and the strife we could spare ourselves when we stop worrying about ourselves and focus on Him. When we stop worrying about the things that don't matter in life. You know, if you think of yourself as the hero of your own story, one day you will disappoint yourself. Is it too late? Has it already happened? Right? Like, we disappoint ourselves. How much freedom could we have if we just lived for Him and not for ourselves? If we tried to follow the threads of His plot rather than our own? What was Gideon doing with that ephod? That wasn't the main plot. There's something there, and he was going down a wrong path. If we follow God's plot, there's a different kind of life that we will be living. It's a different kind of story. We would be joining into His story, which is the true story of life. That's God's story, where we get to meet the greatest hero of all time. And we're not disappointed. We don't just meet Him, but we live with Him. We don't experience Him from afar. We experience Him close to us. We walk with Him. We live a life with Him. And when you meet Jesus, He never disappoints us. He never lets us down. He is the first and He is the last hero.